critical role in history, an invention which has been praised and denounced, served hero and villain alike, and carries with it moral responsibility. To understand the gun is to better understand history. They were men whose lives were ruled by violence, in a time when security came from the guns at their sides, when survival depended on aim, speed, and a willingness to pull the trigger. The Gunslingers, next on Tales of the Gun. The tense, prolonged drama of the Western gunfight. It is a scene played over and over, not only in books and on the screen, but also in our imagination.
Well, the classic Western gunfight that's in our mind is of two men facing off in the street with a camera angle underneath one person's leg looking at the other one. The good guy, he lets the bad guy draw first, and then of course the good guy ends up drawing and shooting the bad guy between the eyes. End of story.
When we think of Western gunfighters, we think of the classic Western gunfight. The problem is it simply never happened. I don't know of a single time in Western history where two guys were actually dumb enough to get out in the middle of the street and challenge each other to a draw. You could get killed like that.
But there is certainly a grain of truth behind the gunslinger legend. And finding it takes us to the Western frontier in the second half of the 19th century. It was a lawless time when the harsh and grimy reality of life came to favor those who were fearless with a gun.
The willingness to step to the edge is what determined whether or not a man had what it took. If you think of the quote from the novel The Shootist, J.B. Brooks, the protagonist, says, most men will hesitate before they pull a trigger. They'll blink an eye or take a breath. I won't.
In the Old West, shootist was a common term for the men who made their reputations with guns. The word gunfighter appeared as early as 1870, but did not come into wide use until later. The word gunslinger is probably a creation of the 20th century. Researchers at Merriam-Webster's have traced it no further than the famous author Zane Grey, who used it in his novel Nevada, written in 1928. The gunslinger, by any name, was the product of a society in which guns were essential tools from the very beginning. With the single-shot guns of early America, formal duels were the closest things to the confrontations we would later call gunfights. In a duel, weapons were often unreliable, and each party could easily miss. Such guns were hardly the weapons to make the West as wild as it would soon become.
The breakthrough technology that made the gunfighter possible is the repeating pistol, being able to shoot multiple times.
The first successful repeating pistol was Samuel Colt's 1836 Patterson revolver, named for the New Jersey location of his factory.
This is a beautiful example of the Patterson revolver. Colt made a breakthrough with firearms with this. Although people had experimented with multiple firing guns before, this was the first truly effective multiple firing pistol.
The first Colt revolver and its successors brought firepower to the West. The pistols held enough ammunition to keep most fights going until the last man was standing. That is, unless they needed reloading.
It was pretty difficult to load these early revolvers. The first thing that you did was pour a powder charge in the chamber. Then you put a ball on top of the chamber. The ball had to be large enough to seal the chamber. You put the ball on top, then you rotate it under the loading lever, which is located beneath the barrel. You pull the loading lever down, and it kind of rams the ball right down on top of the powder. Finally, you turn the gun around and then put a percussion cap on the nipple. The percussion cap is what actually discharges the powder charge.
By 1873, the business of loading a revolver had been drastically simplified when Colt introduced its famous Peacemaker, a 6-gun that used all-in-one metallic cartridges. It was perhaps the most important gun in the West.
This gun, because of its reliability, its powerful cartridge, its balance, its accuracy, was absolutely a superb weapon. It is one of the finest guns ever made.
But other kinds of guns had their places in the gunslinger's arsenal as well.
The gunslinger spent a lot of time at a poker table, and the hideout gun was especially popular with the men who played poker, or the gunslinger. These are the Derringer type guns that were carried as hideout guns in pockets and in coats. That way, if you got into a fight, you could reach into your pocket and have a small shooting device that you could get out very quickly and defend your life with. The most lethal gun in the Old West was the shotgun. When the coaches carried gold or carried money, Wells Fargo always included a shotgun messenger. He carried a sawed-off shotgun called a coach gun. Since the man who was carrying the shotgun on the stagecoach sat next to the driver, that position became known as riding shotgun.
Just as civilization began to tame the Wild West, motion pictures arrived to turn the gunslinger into a modern legend. In 1898, Thomas Edison's Biograph Studios produced Cripple Creek Barroom, which may have been our first movie depicting life in the Old West. It was filmed in New Jersey. 5 years later, the Great Train Robbery proved to be a smash hit, as a desperate gunslinger, played by actor George Barnes, aimed straight ahead and fired to the screams of audiences everywhere. And then there was the 1908 film called The Bank Robbery. Not particularly well made, it nevertheless had one ingredient that intrigues Western fans even today.
The amazing thing about the bank robbery film is that not only do we have a Western here about outlaws, but some of the classic names in the West are in the movie.
Only the experts among Western historians will be able to pick out the blurred images of the real-life gunslingers in the bank robbery. Al Jennings, a bandit from Oklahoma, is seen here with Bill Tillman, one of the Oklahoma lawmen known as the Three Guardsmen. Heck Thomas was another of the famous trio, as was Chris Madsen, who also once rode with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. But these names would fade into obscurity as movies and later television would largely ignore such men, favoring characters such as Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, or Jesse James. Before any of them became famous, however, one man would set the example for all others to follow, writing the interplay of fact and legend across the landscape of time. He was a man many still consider the first gunslinger. In 1867, the cover of Harper's New Monthly magazine introduced the world to one of the West's most colorful characters. The article inside, written by Colonel George Ward Nichols, would make Wild Bill Hickok an American icon.
Wild Bill Hickok is really the first superhero or international star, if you will, of the Wild West.
Wild Bill Hickok exuded charisma. You met him, you never forgot him. He was tall, he was handsome, he was deadly with his guns. He was the kind of a man that when you saw, you immediately respected, and to a certain extent you also feared.
A native of Illinois, Hickok roamed the frontiers in the 1850s as a buffalo hunter and wagon driver, developing the kind of skills with the gun that would later become legendary.
Wild Bill Hickok preferred a pair of 1851 Colt Navies. He wore them in a reverse position like this. He drew the guns by reaching inside and pulling them out like that. Sometimes he wore them in holsters, sometimes in a red sash. Wild Bill was a very good shot. He once told a spectator that he would put 5 shots into the sign on the hotel across the street. And he put 5 shots into the O of the word hotel.
During the Civil War, Hickok served as a civilian scout for the Union Army. Later, his Yankee ties would bring him trouble. Once, in Springfield, Missouri, he was caught in a dispute with an ex-Confederate named Dave Tutt.
Dave Tutt and Wild Bill Hickok were both gamblers, and Hickok had lost all of his money to Tutt, and all he had left was his prized pocket watch, and Tutt won that too. And then Tutt says, I'm not only going to keep this, but until you can pay me what that watch is worth, I'm going to display it in the public square.
Parading the watch in public was an insult to Hickok, and the two men found themselves on the town square. The confrontation would become one of the few face-to-face walk-down shootouts the West would ever see.
Tutt pulled his gun and he fired and missed, but Hickok, it was such a long shot, at least 75 yards across that square, that Hickok would have had to have aimed up in the air so that the bullet would hit his man. And it did. It struck him solid. He turned and ran about 20 feet and fell dead. It was one of the most remarkable pistol shots in Western history.
The Tutt showdown figured prominently in the 1867 Harper's article that brought Hickok fame. Writer George Ward Nichols seemed dazzled by Wild Bill.
Whenever I'd met an officer or soldier who had served in the Southwest, I heard of Wild Bill and his exploits. Yes, Wild Bill with his own hands has killed hundreds of men. Of that I have not a doubt. Colonel George Ward Nichols, 1867.
There's an old saying in the Old West that it takes 2 Easterners to believe 1 Westerner. And there's always been a tradition of lying out west to people who are tenderfeet. And I think Wild Bill was part of that. Legend says that Wild Bill Hickok killed 100 or more men. The actuality is that he probably killed 5 or 6 that we know about, and we don't know who was shooting at who there.
In 1871, a tough cow town called Abilene, Kansas, appointed the now famous gunslinger as its marshal. His job? To keep rowdy cowboys under control. But one day, things got out of hand in Abilene. The tough cowboys were known as Texans, whether they came from Texas or not. One of them, named Phil Coe, was firing his gun at what he claimed was a stray dog. Hickok tried to disarm him, but shots rang out and Coe fell dead. Then, something Hickok never expected.
Wild Bill heard a sound, and it's a sound that once you hear it, you never forget it. It's the sound of a revolver cocking to full cock. It's the sound that makes you know that a bullet is about to be fired. And Wild Bill thought that the Texans were going to shoot him in the back, and he turned and wheeled and he shot his own deputy, Mike Williams. It was a terrible mistake, and he would regret it for the rest of his life.
5 years later, Hickok was at a card game in Deadwood, South Dakota. At age 39, his eyesight was failing, and though he still carried his trusted Colt Navy revolvers, he was no longer the threat that he once was.
A man by the name of Jack McCall walked in and shot him in the back of the head. Why McCall shot Hickok, nobody knows. There's one story that said Hickok had killed his brother, and that didn't prove to be true. In my judgment, it was probably McCall wanted the notoriety of killing the West's most notorious gunfighter. And Hickok, when he fell dead across the table, what he had in his hand was what's become known now as the famous aces and eights, the dead man's hand.
Historians often pick Wild Bill Hickok when asked to name the best gunslingers in the Old West. One of his beautifully engraved Colt navies is proudly displayed at the Gene Autry Museum in Los Angeles, where later Colts belonging to another top gunslinger are also on exhibit. Though highly skilled in shooting, he was a man with none of Hickok's heroic qualities. His name was John Wesley Hardin, a Texan said to have killed 40 men.
John Wesley Hardin was extremely proficient at depopulating areas of the nation. I don't really like him very much. He's too violent. He seems to want to kill just for the sake of killing. But when it comes to terms of skills, he almost had no peer.
He would put on great shooting demonstrations. He could spin twirl guns, and he once put on a shooting demonstrations on the 4th of July where he shot from 15 paces away playing cards, 2 or 3, 4 shots into a playing card. He did that over a dozen times.
Hardin claimed he met Wild Bill Hickok when Bill was Marshal of Abilene, Kansas. Hardin was wearing guns, in violation of town ordinance.
Hickok says, "You can't wear those guns, take them off." And Hardin reaches down, picks them up, hands them to Wild Bill, butt forward, and then rolls them over in his hand, and suddenly Wild Bill is staring right into the barrels.
In the meeting of the West's two best gunslingers, both men backed down. When the state of Texas put a $4,000 bounty on Hardin's head, his days as a killer were numbered. In 1877, Texas Rangers wrestled him down aboard a train, using a gun not to shoot him, but to club him on the head. Hardin's own gun had gotten caught in his suspenders. When the Civil War ended in 1865, not all of its soldiers laid down their arms. Some became gunslingers, applying their wartime skills to a life of crime.
The United States has always had a problem with training young men how to kill people and then turning them loose on the population, and probably nowhere more was that true than in the Civil War.
Among such young men were Frank and Jesse James, who fought in Missouri and Kansas with Quantrill's Raiders, notorious guerrillas of the Confederacy, known for their violence and cruelty. Frank and Jesse, together with their friends, the Younger Brothers, began their criminal careers in Liberty, Missouri on February 13, 1866. It was the first notable bank robbery in American history. The gang took $60,000 from the Clay County Savings Association and killed one bystander.
Jesse James, Frank James, the Younger Brothers, used guns that were available during the Civil War. These guns were percussion guns that were fired and then lifted up and recocked to allow the fired caps to fall out of the way of the mechanism. They usually used a gun in each hand, so they fired, then they lifted up, and they fired again.
A number of guns favored by the James gang survive today. They include a Remington revolver owned by Frank James, a Colt .44 caliber Army pistol said to have been Jesse's, and a big Smith & Wesson Model 3 American which belonged to Cole Younger. The James gang operated in Missouri and surrounding states for 15 years. They stole over $200,000 in at least 17 robberies, their guns taking numerous victims in the process. In Missouri itself, disaffected Southerners cheered them on for targeting the banks and trains controlled by the hated Yankees. Jesse James became a manipulator of the press, helping to turn his crime spree into the stuff of legend.
Jesse James was quite flamboyant, and he also had a flair for the dramatic. He, after one of the train robberies, he left a press release, in essence, telling about the train robbery because he was tired of the press mangling their descriptions and what they were doing. Listen to what they wrote here. The robbers were all large men, none of them under 6 feet tall. They were all masked and started in a southerly direction after they had robbed the train. They were mounted on fine-blooded horses, and of course it was all a lie.
The gang's undoing came in 1876, when the James and Younger brothers tried to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota. Here, in less friendly Northern Territory, the townfolk fought back with guns of their own, decimating the gang as they tried to escape. Frank and Jesse got away, but the 3 Younger brothers were captured and went to prison.
Years later, after Cole Younger was let out of prison, he finally confessed that the 3 men who went into the bank had all consumed a quart of whiskey between them. The Jesse James gang had always prided themselves on lightning rays, but for some reason, if this liquor story can be believed, and I believe it was true, the gang gave too much time for the townspeople to prepare because they were in the bank fumbling around.
Back home in Missouri, Jesse eventually put together a new gang. But the unity and loyalty of the old days were gone. When a $10,000 reward was offered for the James brothers, one new gang member decided to turn traitor. His name was Bob Ford, who in 1882 visited Jesse, then living under the alias J.B. Howard. Ford is thought to have carried the single-action Colt in this photo. As Jesse James stood on a chair to adjust a picture on his wall, Ford pulled his gun and shot Jesse in the back of the head.
At the time of his death, Jesse James was well known as a train robber and a stage robber and a bandit of sorts, but he wasn't famous. What really made Jesse James famous was the song, which went something to the effect, was the dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard and laid Jesse James in his grave.
Together with Jesse James, Billy the Kid is perhaps the most well-known of all the outlaw heroes in the Wild West. His is a story heavily embellished by myth, making the facts and the legend difficult to separate.
Billy the Kid is said to have killed 21 men, a man for every year of his life, and in reality he could have lived to 25 or 26. There's some evidence of that. Also in reality, Billy the Kid probably didn't kill but about 6 people.
The only known photo of Billy the Kid has also misled us. He's armed with a Winchester rifle, another familiar weapon in the gunslinger arsenal. The photo also shows a pistol. It may not be Billy's favorite, the Colt double-action Lightning, but it's important that he wears it on his left hip.
The main thing is that for years we thought Billy the Kid was left-handed. Therefore, you have the movie with Paul Newman as a left-handed gun. Finally, somebody was looking at the Winchester and they noticed that the loading gate was on the left-hand side. Well, everybody that knows Winchesters know that the loading gate is on the right-hand side. And guess what? The photo was a tintype. It was backwards. So we turn it over and guess what? He's right-handed.
His real name was Henry Antrim, and somewhere along the line, he took the alias William Bonney. A youth among older men in the West, he became known as the Kid. As with many Western legends, a name often contributes to fame.
I think that the names and the way they sound have a lot to do with why we remember them. For example, Billy the Kid's real name was Henry. How many movies would you go see about Henry the Kid, Henry? It doesn't have that ring that Billy the Kid has.
Billy's notoriety was launched when he emerged as one of the best of the hired guns in the Lincoln County War of the late 1870s in New Mexico. The conflict was won between ranchers and merchants who tried to use bullets to eliminate the competition. Billy was on the losing side of the Lincoln County War, and local politicians made him a wanted man. Sheriff Pat Garrett, later famous himself, captured the Kid, who was imprisoned in the Lincoln County Courthouse, sentenced to hang. The site today is well preserved because what happened next would make Billy the Kid into a nationwide legend.
Billy was held at the Lincoln County Courthouse under the surveillance of two guards, J.W. Bell and Bob Ollinger.
Ollinger had gone across the street to the Wortley Hotel to get a bite to eat, and the kid and Bell are playing cards, and the kid said he needed to go to the outside toilet. So Bell took him downstairs to the toilet, and somebody had apparently put a gun underneath the seat. And the kid turns with that gun, and he shot Bell down, but Bell stumbled out into the yard and died.
Billy grabbed Ollinger's shotgun, ran to the window. Ollinger, at the sound of the first shot, ran out of the hotel, and someone yelled, "The kid's killed Bell." Ollinger looked up and he said, "He's killed me too." It's probably the most audacious escape on the records in the Old West.
Pat Garrett was now in pursuit again. In his own dime novel on the subject, he later spoke of a midnight trip to Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Garrett was questioning a man named Pete Maxwell when Billy the Kid entered the darkened room.
Quickly as possible, I drew my revolver and fired. Threw my body aside and fired again. The second shot was useless. The kid fell dead. Pat Garrett, 1882.
Although Garrett placed his famous shot in the dark in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, there's reason to believe the true facts are different.
I believe Pat Garrett got to Pete Maxwell's house early, tied up Paulita Maxwell, Pete's sister, who was enamored of Billy the Kid, tied her up and waited in ambush for Billy the Kid to come in the door, and then Pat Garrett shot the kid down in cold blood.
In 1925, author Walter Noble Burns would resurrect Billy's story, writing a book that magnified the legend, launching the popular myth into the age of movies and television. Burns was also one of the writers who helped preserve another legend when he wrote of a place called Tombstone and the most famous gunfight the world has ever known. On October 26, 1881, a handful of men in Tombstone, Arizona pointed guns at each other and began shooting. The next day, a local paper reported the results.
3 men hurled into eternity in the duration of a moment. Stormy as were the early days of Tombstone, nothing ever occurred equal to the event of yesterday. Tombstone Epitaph, October 27, 1881.
In truth, nothing anywhere has ever quite equaled the gunfight at the OK Corral, as it would later be known. The battle pitting Wyatt Earp and his brothers against the Clanton and McClowry brothers is undoubtedly the most famous shootout of all time.
The gunfight at the OK Corral is legendary because it has all the elements of high drama. You have the Earp brothers walking down a dusty street. You have the walk down, which shows a moral decision has been made. Also, the story of the gunfight is part of a larger story, which carries that gunfight to the next generation and generations after that.
The story centers on the legendary Wyatt Earp, whose name has become symbolic of the heroic Western lawman. But his is also a history of how fact inspires myth. It begins with the reputation Earp had among his friends.
35 years ago, that immense territory stretching from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean knew no braver man than Wyatt Earp. He was the only man whom I regarded as absolutely destitute of fear. Bat Masterson, 1907.
Bat Masterson was himself a celebrated frontier lawman. He became friends with Wyatt Earp when the two were buffalo hunters on the Great Plains in the 1870s. Later, Wyatt would become deputy town marshal of Dodge City, Kansas, where Masterson was the county sheriff. Earp was known to keep shotguns hidden in saloons around town in case of trouble. He carried a revolver, usually a Colt single action, but was not eager for gunplay in enforcing the law.
He would hit them with his gun. That was called buffaloing. Now, if you're going to strike an outlaw, you don't hit him with the back of the gun, you hit him with the front of the gun like this. Wyatt would lay that across a man's head or across his temple, and that way if he didn't fall down, you could at least cock the weapon and shoot him down.
In 1879, Wyatt Earp moved to Tombstone, Arizona with his brothers Virgil and Morgan, men who enjoyed reputations as brave lawmen in their own right. But the Earps were also involved in saloon keeping and gambling, professions in the boomtowns considered as respectable as most.
Wyatt and his brothers were boomers. They basically went from town to town looking for the next best thing, the next sure thing. They were looking for the, the big chance.
Virgil became Tombstone's town marshal, Wyatt and Morgan his deputies. As pro-Northern Republicans, they faced a web of political animosity. They were natural enemies to Democratic County Sheriff Johnny Behan, who tolerated the cattle rustling activities of his friends, a pair of ex-Texas cowboy families named Clanton and McClowry. On the day of the gunfight, months of arguments, threats, and accusations lay as groundwork for the tension in Tombstone. The principal characters scarcely suspected where the events would lead them. At a vacant lot near the OK Corral, Frank McClowry waited with his brother Tom, who Wyatt Earp had pistol whipped earlier in the morning. Billy Clanton was there as well, with his brother Ike, who, after making public threats that day, also felt the slap of an Earp gun. The three Earp brothers solemnly walked down the Tombstone street. With them was Doc Holliday, the tubercular gambler who once saved Wyatt Earp's life in Dodge City, and thus became his lifelong friend. Virgil, as marshal, was determined to arrest the cowboys for violating the town ordinance against carrying guns. Perhaps to appear less threatening, he exchanged a shotgun for Doc Holliday's cane.
He fires and the shot goes between Morgan and Wyatt.
Researchers like Jeff Morey have spent years poring over the historical record to gain an accurate understanding of just what happened at the infamous gunfight.
He throws his right hand over his left forearm. He says, "I've got you this time." It began when Wyatt and Virgil entered the lot. Doc Holliday and Morgan Earp remained in the street. Immediately, Virgil could see that at least Frank McClowry and Billy Clanton were still armed. So he held up his arms and yelled out, "Throw up your hands, boys. I intend to disarm you." Frank McClowry replied, "We will." But instead of holding his hands up, he made a grab for his pistol at his right hip.
Such moments, and exactly what they meant, would fuel controversy for years to come. Why would Frank McClowry say, "We will," and then reach for his gun? The answer may never be known.
Wyatt knows Frank McClowry is a dangerous man, so he pulls his pistol from his overcoat pocket. Virgil Earp sees Frank's move and holds up Doc Holliday's cane and yells out, "Hold on, I don't want that." And McClowry hesitates.
Virgil would later say he told McClowry to hold because he heard the cowboys cock their guns. As Wyatt Earp and Frank McClowry drew their pistols, Billy Clanton reacted.
Billy Clanton is blind to Frank McClowry's move. His eyes are on his adversaries, the Earps, and he sees Wyatt's play. So he reaches across his body and pulls his own pistol and fires at the same time Wyatt does. Two shots go off simultaneously.
Clanton's shot missed, but Wyatt's bullet struck Frank McClowry, who stumbled into the street.
Wyatt could never say who fired first. The shots were that close together. Any number of witnesses testified the shots were so close together that they couldn't have come from the same weapon.
The die had been cast, and events became unstoppable. Morgan and Virgil Earp each fired at Billy Clanton, who stumbled against a building wall, hit in his wrist and torso.
Billy Clanton is firing as fast as he can. He's doing what we call today spray and pray. He's not lining up on his target. He's just letting loose as quickly as he can.
Ike Clanton ran up to Wyatt, claiming to be unarmed and pleading for mercy. Wyatt told him to fight or get out. Tom McClowry, still untouched by gunfire, now faced Doc Holliday, who hit him with a deadly blast from his shotgun. Holliday now turned to Frank McClowry, wounded but still standing.
He throws down on Doc, which means he throws his right hand over his left forearm and yells out, "I've got you this time." Doc replies, "Blaze away, you're a daisy if you have."
Daisy was a popular word of the day for anything quite exceptional, but McClowry had little time to appreciate it. A shot from Morgan Earp struck him under the right ear. The fight was over. 3 cowboys lay dead. Virgil and Morgan were wounded. The eternity of gunfire had lasted less than a minute.
The gunfight took only 30 seconds. There were maybe 28 to 31 shots fired. Initially, you had 2 quick shots, a slight pause because people were surprised at what was unfolding. Then the firing became general. And people who heard it that day said it sounded like firecrackers going off very quick.
Later would come the recriminations. The Earps, accused of murder, were cleared by the law, but never forgiven by their enemies in Tombstone. A dark sequel would follow the shootout, and a series of events that, among the brothers, would catapult Wyatt Earp to worldwide fame. In the gunfight at the OK Corral, the widely heralded weapons of Colt are thought to have been the prime players, together with guns from companies like Smith & Wesson or Remington. The gunslinger hardware proved its deadly effectiveness. The 3 men killed were honored with an elaborate funeral. It was not an incident for Tombstone, Arizona to celebrate. The Earp brothers and Doc Holliday, victors in the showdown, were charged with murder. But the case was dropped and their enemies took action. Morgan Earp was killed, ambushed by an assassin while playing billiards. Virgil was seriously wounded by gunmen outside a Tombstone saloon. What happened next, some say, launched their brother Wyatt into lasting fame.
Wyatt Earp becomes a legend when, after his brother Morgan is killed, he takes the law into his own hands, and in a 1-week-long vendetta ride, he hunts the men he thinks responsible and shoots them down. From that moment on, this story is covered nationally, and it puts a cap to the whole Tombstone experience. He's the one that mops up. He's the one that brings the story to a conclusion, and that's why that story is Wyatt Earp's story.
But his story would not be easy to tell. After years of wandering the West, Wyatt retired to Los Angeles, where he seldom spoke of the old days. Bat Masterson, who became a professional writer, would speak of Wyatt to his friend, former President Theodore Roosevelt.
Mr. President, the real story of the Old West can never be told unless Wyatt Earp will tell what he knows. And Wyatt will not talk. Bat Masterson, 1910.
Stuart Lake, Roosevelt's press agent, later said he was inspired by Masterson's remark to write Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. This book, published in 1931, would make its subject perhaps the most famous gunslinger of them all.
These things that Wyatt Earp did made him a myth in his own era. But the judgment of the years has awarded a higher honor to the man. The Old West cannot be understood unless Wyatt Earp is understood. Stuart Lake, 1931.
Despite the book's title, Wyatt Earp was never more than a deputy marshal, and there is little doubt that Lake filled his work with exaggerations. In cooperating with the writer, Earp was attempting to counter stories written by his enemies, making him out to be a villain.
Many wrong impressions of the early days of Tombstone and myself have been created by writers who were not informed correctly. And this has caused me a concern, which I feel deeply. Wyatt Earp, 1923.
Over the years, several historians have accused Wyatt of being a glory hunter, puffing himself up and filling Lake with a lot of stories. The fact of the matter is, Lake meets with Wyatt only 4 or 5 times, and then suddenly Wyatt Earp dies.
The obituaries announced Earp's death in Los Angeles on January 13, 1929. Author Stuart Lake, suddenly unable to speak to Earp himself, now continued researching his story by talking to Earp's friends.
These people were in a state of mourning, as it were. They were remembering someone who just passed away. And because of that, they were eulogizing Wyatt. And a lot of that carries over into the type of story and the image you have presented in Lake's book.
It was the image of a super marshal, a quintessential good guy, that became a model for Henry Fonda's Wyatt Earp in the film My Darling Clementine, and served as a template for Western heroes for years to come. Among the most intriguing stories Stuart Lake told is that of Wyatt Earp's gun, a magnificent Colt revolver with an extended barrel 10 or 12 inches long. Lake called it the Buntline Special. Most examples known today are reproductions.
The story is Ned Buntline, a dime novel writer, made a presentation of 5 extra long barrel guns to Wyatt Earp and 4 other Western peace officers in Kansas. The problem we have is there are no records of such a presentation being made in the Old West.
The most intriguing evidence that Wyatt Earp did have a long-barreled revolver comes from Apollona Bauer, a butcher in Tombstone who witnessed Wyatt's pistol whipping of Tom McLaury before the famous gunfight. He described the gun Wyatt used that day as fairly large, 14 to 16 inches in length. A Colt with a 10-inch barrel measures out exactly 15 inches. I've looked at Stuart Lake's notes and his letters, and it's clear he believed the guns were real. In one letter he says, "The guns are worthless now as a weapon. I'd be happy to pay a fair price for it." If that gun would show up today, it'd be worth well over $1 million, one of the rarest of the rare.
Take care of your friend.
In 1955, the Buntline Special was carried by the hero of a TV series called The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, starring Hugh O'Brien. The show's technical consultant was Stuart Lake, author of Earp's biography.
It was the first adult Western on TV. The idea was to do scripts about a man who actually lived and stories about people who actually lived in a time that actually happened.
I think that that TV show did much to make Wyatt Earp's fame, so much so that he is probably the most famous lawman in American history.
The idealized Wyatt Earp of television was a far cry from the real man, in appearance and action as well. To play TV's Wyatt, Hugh O'Brien decided he'd learn to draw his gun faster than anyone expected him to.
Well, it's quicker than the eye can blink. You have to remember one thing. We were using blanks, and there was nobody shooting back.
The sport of fast draw uses a holster that was developed in the 1950s. It didn't exist in the Old West. It is a low-slung, metal-lined holster that ties to the leg. The old cowboy would not have had a holster like that, and he would not have understood the importance of fast draw. In fact, Wyatt Earp said the most important thing to do in a gunfight is to take your time, in a hurry. Hold it!
Western TV shows and films have become scarce in recent years, and the romantic vision of the Old West has lost favor on the screen. Super Marshal Wyatt Earp of the 1950s is no longer in style.
People today want a lot of violence, and in order for our shows to be exciting, we had to manufacture not necessarily violence, but we had to manufacture action. I mean, you could go for days in Tombstone and not have a gunfight or a fight.
For many, the heroism of the Gunslingers is an ideal best left to fiction. But their memory is one that can never be forgotten. As figures in history, they challenged authority and asserted independence, whatever their motives. And as one writer once said, wherever courage is the currency, the Western gunfighter will always endure.